So anyway, we'll see what happens. It's nothing too soon for this.
It doesn't ring a bell with me. I don't remember she was young.
Maybe that was the bigger street. Yeah, that's a bigger street. Okay, so if you're coming from Harbor,
I just wanted to say hello.
wherever that big street was,
Albion Street. Yeah. It's over there.
that's right, you can see the lines come down.
Yeah. My kids love that neighborhood.
Not big time. Okay. All right. Well, let's just see what it is.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Hello. How are you? So glad to see you. It's so nice to see you. Give me a coffee. I know it's and you're the kickoff.
No, because the Sunday movie. Oh my gosh.
How do you never age?
Our first trip to this. You get a certain momentum, but we're going to be next 2 weeks. He'll be around. In the beginning, good to see you.
Oh, absolutely. You need to scoot over a little bit more. Is that are there enough seats? Yeah. Okay. Oh, we can. Yeah, we can do. We're not like. Yeah. Are you sure? It's good to see you. Oh, if you don't mind, sure. Yeah. Well, no, it's okay. And this way you've got a better view.
Right up here.
Oh, sure.
Okay, everyone. I know people are getting reacquainted. It's wonderful to see all of you here. I want to welcome you to the inaugural event of the week in which we honor the Department of Art History's 100th year at UW-Madison. Cheers. All right. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Anna Andrzejewski. I had the honor of chairing the Centennial Celebration Committee this year, and I'm also the Frank Lloyd Wright Professor in Modern American Architecture. It's really great to see so many friendly faces here tonight. I do want to issue a reminder at the start of this talk that we are on ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk Nation, a place that their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. We acknowledge the circumstances that led to the forced removal of the Ho-Chunk people and honor their legacy of resistance and resilience. This history of colonization informs our work and vision for a collaborative future. UW recognizes and respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other First Nations within the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin. We have an exciting lineup of events planned over the next few days. There are pamphlets, trifolds out in the lobby. All of these events are geared toward celebrating our centennial. They follow along a series of events that we also held last year. And we want to thank everyone who has made this possible. Both last year and today. And I want to begin by thanking the Chazen Museum of Art for their incredible partnership. They hosted many of our events over the last few weeks. In case you haven't noticed, our building is encased in a scaffolding and it's very dark. So we really want to thank the Chazen for their hospitality here. I also want to give thanks to the incredible administrative team within the Department of Art History, particularly Peggy Hacker and Jane McCarthy, and without their logistical skills and finesse, we would not be here today starting on time. We could not have mounted the extraordinary series of events without our supporters and co-sponsors. Our events for the Centennial have been supported by generous funding from the Anonymous Fund, the Dean's Office of the College of Letters and Science, and the UW Lectures Committee, and of course our generous donors, including contributors to the Gombar Duychak Lecture Fund, which of course is supporting tonight's talk, and you'll hear more about this shortly. I also want to thank our co-sponsors tonight for tonight's lecture, which include the Nancy M. Bruce Center for Design and Material Culture, the Center for East Asian Studies, and the Chazen Museum of Art. Finally, 100 years is an amazing feat. My husband also reminded me last night, he's like, wow, you've been here a quarter of the time. I was like, wow, that's an amazing feat. But beyond looking sort of fondly back at our history, the department is using this opportunity to look forward, to take stock and think about our next century. We set a high bar with our $2 million centennial fundraising campaign. And tomorrow at the Centennial reception, which I hope all of you can attend, we'll have an update on where we stand with that important fundraising effort. But I want to take this moment to invite you to join us in supporting our future. We're particularly looking for gifts that can support graduate student research and field experiences for undergraduate and graduate students. If you're interested, please find me at one of the Centennial events, and I'd be happy to talk to you about our fundraising priorities. So with that, I want to turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Yu-Hung Lee, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Anna. So before I introduce our distinguished speaker today, I would like to take a few minutes to speak about the history of this lecture series. The Gombar Duychak Lecture on Early Modern Print Culture was established through a generous gift from Thomas Gombar and his wife, Linda Duychak. Thomas Gombar, who sadly passed away in March 2015, was the late amateur a curator of visual resource for our Department of Art History, serving from 1988 to 2007. During these years, Tom was both physically and metaphorically at the heart of the department's growth and its entry into the technological age. From his central office in the Auditorium building, he managed a collection of over 330,000 slides, transforming it into a major digital resource. He managed the physical remodeling of our classrooms in order to use the new technology and designed and administered 38 websites. Through planned grants, meticulous administration, and innovative ideas, he made us a model of visual resource innovation. Linda Duychak, his wife, served as the art reference and instruction librarians at the Color Art Library from 2002 to 2016. She was the creator of the Color Art Library's first website and developed the UW Digital Collection's renowned digital library for the decorative arts. She was also instrumental in supporting course-related instruction efforts which led the establishment of the dedicated teaching space in 2016. As we celebrate our centennial this week, we want to express our profound gratitude for the contributions of Thomas Gombar and Linda Duychak. They are both an integral part of the legacy of this department. So now I would like to introduce our speaker today. I have the great honor of following in the footsteps of Professor Julian Murray in teaching Chinese art history in this department. It is therefore a particular privilege to introduce her today. On this special occasion of our department's 100th anniversary. I remember that in 1996, when I first immigrated to US, I landed in Honolulu, where my husband studied Chinese philosophy in the University of Hawaii. In a backyard sale, I spent $1 and bought a book, my very first book in the US, which is the Flooring in the Shadows, Woman in the History of Chinese and Japanese Painting, edited by Marshall Wedner. Professor Murray has an article in it. It is entitled Didactic Art for Women, the Ladies' Classics of Filial Piety. This $1 book is actually, you don't need much money to change your life, probably. So this $1 book really changed my life. At that time, I was not sure what to do in the next stage of my life. This book and her article really enlightened me. I used her article not just to study English, but also to rethink the history of Chinese art from gender perspective. Professor Murray received her BA and MA in Chinese Studies from Yale University and another MA and PhD from Princeton University in Chinese Art and Archaeology and East Asian Studies. Before joining the faculty position in our department at UW-Madison, she held curatorial positions in Metropolitan Museum, Fear Gallery, and Harvard Art Museum. She taught in the art history department from 1889 to 2012. So she received numerous fellowships and has published about 7 books and catalogs, as well as about 70 articles. So I just got permission from Professor Murray that I don't need to read the titles of her books. Although we know her primarily as an art historian of the Song period, her publications show that her scholarship stretched from the Neolithic to the contemporary era. She is a pioneer in the field of Chinese art history, renowned for her groundbreaking research on the interplay between art, politics, and religion in China. During the late 1970s and 80s, when most scholars in the Chinese field focused on master painters and landscape paintings, her work examined the relationship between the so-called high art, like painting and calligraphy, and works categorized as craft, such as sculpture or stone engravings, long before this approach became common practice. Her research on narrative paintings, illustrations, and prints has profoundly shaped the field, offering lasting insights into the cultural forces that have shaped one of the world's most enduring artistic traditions. I also want to stress that her outstanding scholarship made her, and by extension, the art history department at the UW-Madison, known throughout the field in North America, Europe, and China. In other words, she put our program on the map. Lastly, during her time at UW-Madison, she used her personal connections to help establish the Charles Killen Wisconsin Distinguished Graduate Fellowship to support students in East Asian art. Nearly every graduate student in Chinese and Japanese art has benefited from this fellowship. I want to thank her wholeheartedly for her profound devotion to the department. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Murray to the podium.
Thank you, Yuhang. That was really incredible. I'm not sure who you're talking about, frankly. Very kind, very kind. And it's very gratifying for me to have a successor in the department who is advancing scholarship on Chinese art so brilliantly as you are. I also want to thank the department for inviting me back to help celebrate the centennial and to give this talk in the Gombar Duychak series. I vividly recall my first meeting with Tom Gombar when I arrived on campus as a new assistant professor in 1989. Before coming, I'd been told that the department had applied for a grant to buy slides for my courses. This was back in the good old days when we taught with 35mm slides. Tom was in charge of the slide collection, and he informed me that the grant application had been turned down. I must have looked very alarmed. In fact, I thought I might have to quit right there on the spot. Then he said with a straight face, actually, the department had funds from a donor that would take care of the purchase of these slides, so all was well. Over the years, I grew to understand Tom's very dry sense of humor, and he took wonderful care of me and my visual needs of slides and then eventually digital images. And as for Linda, I was always very grateful for her assistance as reference librarian in the Kohler Art Library. Linda would give a presentation to each of my seminars to help students find good materials for writing their papers, even though Chinese art was not her area. Her calm and thorough approach was incredibly reassuring for all of us, and I certainly learned about a lot of resources that I would not have otherwise found myself. And finally, I wanted to express how proud I am of the Department of Art History and what its faculty have achieved in studying the arts of the world as the discipline has evolved and changed over recent decades. Now, my talk today on Chinese illustrated books includes materials that certainly would not have been studied in 1925 by art historians or scholars of book history, or probably historians of any type, but nowadays is fair game for all of these and other fields. I'm starting with the period from the late 16th through mid-17th centuries, which is often called the golden age of illustration in woodblock printed Chinese books, and I'll end up in the 19th century while following the permutations of one specific book in more detail based on research that I started while teaching here. The final decades of the Ming Dynasty, which fell in 1644, saw a major increase in the quantities and types of illustrated books in a range of genres. Woodblock printing technology was already well established, having originated around the 7th century to produce multiple copies of religious texts, and becoming much more widespread in the 12th and 13th centuries for secular purposes as well. During the Ming, woodblock printing was done at the imperial and princely courts, government offices, schools, commercial publishers, and private individuals' places. But the great increase in the 16th century, the late 16th century in particular, was due to especially the commercial publishers. Workshops in Nanjing, Hangzhou, and Zhenyang in particular addressed a growing and diversified market for all kinds of books, not just canonical works such as the Confucian classics and the dynastic histories, but also entertaining books for leisure time enjoyment, including plays, novels, and catalogs of various arts, some of which contain pictures. Many of the most appealing and beautifully illustrated ones were published in the prosperous urban centers of the lower Yangtze Delta, around this area, and the map shows some of the cities in more detail. In this region, there were highly educated and often wealthy members of the official class, and a much larger number of literate men at various stages of the official civil service system, the examination system, as well as prosperous merchants and men and women of more modest literacy. Some books produced at this time also found their way to Korea, Japan, and even Europe. In a collection of essays called Wuzazu, or Five Miscellanies, published in 1616, a culturally conservative and eminent scholar official named Xie Zhaozhe lamented the state of commercial printing. He started the discussion by comparing contemporary Ming publishing with the outstanding ones during the Sung Dynasty, some 4 centuries earlier. Hangzhou, in particular, had produced fine publications during the Sung, but Xie felt that the quality of its productions had declined to the point of being hardly worth mentioning by his own day. On the other hand, Zhenyang in northern Fujian had produced mediocre books in the Sung Dynasty and was just doing so at a much greater volume in contemporary times. Xie's complaints focused on a couple of specific points. He had some general observation and expressed views that he shared with a variety of critics, particularly that too many worthwhile books were being published very hastily and sloppily, often with wrong characters or missing elements, and on poor quality paper. Careless editing and low quality printing posed a particular problem in texts and commentaries of the Confucian classics and dynastic histories, which probably were most often used by people seeking access to higher education and cultural expertise, perhaps preparing to take the civil service examinations. Commercial publishers made knowledge available to a broad segment of society at affordable prices, and cheap books were likely to be carelessly handled and intensively used, such as by adding punctuation, marginal comments, and dots for emphasis, the equivalent of yellow highlighter. For example, in this late Ming edition of a pedagogical collection of notes on the Confucian classic of rites, the notes in red ink call attention to incorrectly written characters. Here we also see occasional clarifications about individual characters printed in black above the frame, and the paper is so thin that the characters on the other side show through. Xie Zhaozhe noted that it made sense for commercial publishers to cut corners and save on the costs of labor and materials since they were looking to make a quick profit, particularly when they used an existing printed copy of a book as the basis for cutting new woodblocks. Rather than renting the original ones, they could reduce costs by employing less skilled copyists and block carvers and by using low-quality paper and wood. Another example shows how publishers might print so many copies from the same blocks that the later impressions became increasingly blurry as the blocks wore down or developed splits. These two impressions of a page from a late Ming edition of the Life of Confucius were made at different times, and the one on the left shows that some of the characters had become completely illegible. This amount of wear also suggests that the book was in great demand. On the other hand, Xie Zhaozhe and other critics thought that Ming publishers were devoting exquisite craftsmanship and great expense to categories of books that were unworthy because they merely provided pleasure. The examples that he singled out by name include three well-known and highly engaging works of fiction, drama, and opera: The Water Margin, or Shui Hu Zhuan, The Western Chamber, Xi Xiangji, and The Tale of the Lute, Pipa Ji. All three were available in multiple editions, some of them illustrated. And in addition to these books, Xie Zhaozhe disparaged two catalogs of designs for ink cakes, which represented the growing category of publications devoted to collections of various kinds and appealed to consumers with money to spend and leisure to enjoy it. Nowadays, these allegedly frivolous publications rank among the glories of Chinese cultural and artistic achievement. The first of the five titles that Xie mentions by name is Shui Hu Zhuan, The Water Margin, an episodic novel that describes the exploits of a colorful band of 12th century outlaws, bandits. The lively narrative focuses on their violent, if sometimes righteous, mayhem, and they eventually become defenders of the realm. The popular work is represented here by the Rungyutang edition, published in 1610 in Hangzhou, a center whose decline from its peak in the Sung period is specifically noted by Xie Zhaozhe. The full title of this edition mentions annotations by the renowned iconoclast Li Zhi, a recently deceased Ming official and writer. And let's see, that's down here, Li Zhuowu, Piping, etc. So they claim that this famous man wrote notes on the novel. Commercial firms were notorious for falsely claiming that famous men were involved in writing or editing their publications in order to make the books stand out in an increasingly crowded market. In addition, this book has 200 illustrations, 2 per chapter, of which 100 were copied from a 1589 edition published in Xinnan. This larger number seems meant to enhance this version's appeal over other editions, some of which were not illustrated at all. The inventive and lively compositions are well drawn and carefully carved to convey close-up views of the action. The second title on Xie Zhaozhe's list is Xi Xiangji, or The Western Chamber, a romantic drama that celebrates a young couple whose courtship violated Confucian social norms. The romance is between Ying Ying, the beautiful daughter of a high minister, and poor but promising scholar Zhang. It begins when they happen to encounter one another at a monastery and are smitten, but her mother opposes a marriage between them. Instead of accepting the situation, they secretly carry on an illicit relationship with the help of the young woman's maid. Finally, they are allowed to marry after scholar Zhang passes the civil service examination and gains a prestigious office. In addition to live performance, this popular play attracted numerous Ming publishers who produced illustrated editions across a broad spectrum of artistic quality. Here we're looking at the late 16th century edition from Jianyang, whose vigorously drawn pictures refer to conventions of live theater with large figures making dramatic gestures and shallow spaces. A few decades later, The last years of the Ming saw the publication of some highly refined editions of the Western Chamber. An example from 1639, published in Hangzhou, contains 6 pictures designed by the great figure painter Chen Hongshou, on whom I wrote my senior thesis. One scene cleverly uses the backdrop of a folding screen decorated with outsized blooming plants to convey Ying Ying's passionate response to a secret letter from scholar Zhang brought by her maid, who surreptitiously watches her read it. A pair of large butterflies symbolizes romantic love, and their unusually large size here emphasizes that point. An even more inventive edition published the following year in 1640 in Nanjing shows the lovers' first meeting at the monastery, portrayed as if it were a scene decorating a ceramic bowl. This perhaps alludes to the frequent use of themes from popular drama and fiction on blue and white porcelains. In the scene of Ying Ying reading the love letter, this edition shows her behind a screen and largely hidden. So we see only her skirts and her reflection in the mirror on the lacquer table, while her maid is spying on her from behind the screen. The screen painting here depicts a solitary boatman, alluding to imagery that scholar Zhang used to express his loneliness. Such compositions call the viewer's attention to the sheer sensual pleasure of looking. However, the play displeased moralists more because it sympathetically portrayed young lovers who disobeyed parental orders and even engaged in sex, but they were rewarded with a happy ending. 2 other titles that Xie Zhaozhe named as works unworthy of their lavish production are catalogs of ink cakes, Fangshi Mo Pu by Fang Yulu, published in 1588 for the first time, and Chengshi Moyuan, Master Cheng's Garden of Inks, published by Chen Junfang, who's better known as Cheng Dayue. Ink was one of the so-called 4 treasures of the scholar's studio, and often took the form of decoratively molded sticks and cakes. Fang and Zheng were competitors in actual ink production, and their respective catalogs contain hundreds of illustrations of elegant designs. Many of the same pictures appear in both books. It was not uncommon for commercial firms to openly copy successful products from competitors, which is true now too. For instance, both books have the same picture of 5 pine trees as the design for a circular ink cake, which can be matched by a physical ink cake that may have been made much later. Many of the designs incorporated calligraphy in a variety of scripts, different types of script, different styles of each script, as well as pictorial subjects from various genres, and some of them are attributed to famous artists. In addition to advertising the products of the 2 ink makers' workshops, the beautifully printed catalogs were rewarding simply to peruse for pleasure. Master Fang's catalog of inks was so popular that several late Ming publishers used printed copies to carve new blocks for pirated versions, while Fang Yulu's son continued to use the original blocks to print new copies. It's worth noting that Fang's catalog included a preface by a high official and cultural luminary named Li Weizhen, who also wrote a preface to Xie Zhaozhe's book, but evidently he did not share Xie's low opinion of the ink catalog. We will be hearing more about Li's opinions in a little bit. Now, the contents of Master Cheng's Garden of Inks were even more wide-ranging and ambitious than Master Fang's, making it far more than a mere sales catalog. Cheng catered to a current interest in novelty, and an addendum even includes 4 designs copied from Christian religious prints that the Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci is believed to have given him in Nanjing in 1606. One of them was a copperplate engraving of the Madonna and Child, made in 1597 in the Jesuit mission in Nagasaki, Japan. after a Flemish print based on the fresco painting of Nuestra Señora de la Antigua in Seville Cathedral in Spain. Chung also accompanied his pictures with lots of texts, from poems to essays and testimonials, to make his book more elegant. Some of these texts were not in his original edition, but he solicited them from scholars to whom he gave the book as a gift, and then he added his text to his later impressions. In addition, some copies of the book include dozens of pictures printed in color. This is created by applying different pigments to separate areas of the same carved block, rather than using the slightly later technique of printing each color from a separate block. Color printing could be used to make the prints look more like paintings, which had higher status. In this picture, we see scholars enjoying leisure in a garden with a poem above the image. I'm talking about this one here. The facing page contains additional poems by Chung and his friends, and they follow directly after a pair of pages that are devoted to the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove, who were very famous cultural luminaries of a much earlier period of sort of 4th, 5th, 6th century. The implication, very clearly, is that Chung and his associates were the modern-day successors to these great cultural figures. Now, Master Chung was not the only publisher to explore the potential of color printing as a special effect to attract customers. Nanjing publishers of erotica also helped to develop it, and several examples that were long preserved only in Japan have come to light in recent decades. It seems that this most obviously disreputable type of publication played an important role in advancing the technology of color printing using multiple blocks, in Japan as well as China. A close contemporary of Master Chung's Garden of Inks is a book called Pictures of the Height of Sophistication, Fengliu Juechangtu, from 1606, of which 3 versions partially survive. One includes a 1606 dated preface signed with the pseudonym retired scholar Ailing Crane of Dunghai, who says that this reproduced a hand-scroll painting by Tang Yin, who was notorious for erotic paintings, among other things. I guess the notoriety was the erotic paintings, but he was noted for other things, I'm trying to say. The pictorial seal at upper left is that of the 20th century Japanese collector Shibui Kiyoshi, and in the lower left is a signature of one of the members of the Huang workshop, the prestigious printers who had branches not only in Huizhou, but Nanjing and Hangzhou as well. A couple of the original 24 illustrations are mildly suggestive, but most are graphically sexual. All of the compositions are well designed and finely drawn and depict elegant settings of gardens, scholars' studios, boudoirs, and each scene is accompanied by contemporary poetry, suggesting that the intended audience included members of the highly educated elite who resided in Nanjing, which was the Ming's secondary capital, and people there didn't always have enough to do. Many such people were former officials or disengaged bureaucrats who had the wealth and leisure to indulge in sensual pleasures. On the other hand, perhaps the presence of poetry alongside the sexual images allowed viewers to pretend that their chief interest was literary rather than lascivious, in much the same way that subscribers to Playboy would point out that the magazine contained serious essays by famous writers. The appeal of the Pictures of the Height of Sophistication and other Ming erotic books certainly extended beyond the original audience of Nanjing aesthetes, although such works were severely criticized and not preserved in China, especially after the Qing conquest. In fact, these examples have survived only because they were taken to Japan, where they contributed to the development of themes and techniques associated with Japanese ukiyo-e. A Japanese book based on pictures of the height of sophistication and published in the 1680s provides direct evidence of the stimulus from imported Chinese erotica. I might note that the Chinese text of the poem that accompanies this Japanese picture, first in Chinese characters and then in kana, it's actually matched with a different and much more explicit picture in the Chinese book. I won't let you read it. Perhaps Xie Zhaozhou was right to complain about such attractively designed and carefully printed publications such as these. But he was exaggerating when he suggested that book publishers devoted care and expense only to unworthy subjects. The eminent literatus and high official Li Weizhen evidently disagreed with him, as I mentioned earlier, since he contributed prefaces to both Xie Zhaozhou's 5 miscellanies and to Master Fang's Catalogue of Ink. In 1604, Li composed a preface to another Nanjing publication whose attractive designs and careful workmanship demonstrate that some books did combine aesthetic appeal with orthodox moral content. The work in question is an edition of Dijian Tu Shuo, the Emperor's Mirror, illustrated and discussed. I'll just refer to it as the Emperor's Mirror, but the illustrated and discussed is very important, pictures and explanation. This is a topic that I and others have studied in detail and have published on, so I'm just really kind of recapping some of what I've already said elsewhere. The work contains 117 stories of ancient rulers' deeds, 81 as admirable models to imitate, and 36 as cautionary examples to avoid. Here is one of the many scenes in which a good emperor summoned Confucian officials to give him a lecture on the classics. A text on the following page explains the historical circumstances in detail. This book was published by an obscure official named Jin Lian, whom Li Weizhen praises for providing dilettantes, or haoshizhe, with a substantive portrayal of the past. And Li suggests that the book could serve as an antidote to the chaotic current state of Ming governance. Well, what was it? For many years, the Wanli emperor had refused to meet with high officials or even to acknowledge communications from them, allowing palace eunuchs to conduct government affairs. Jin Lian was taking a big risk by publishing this book because the emperor had violently repudiated the original compiler, late senior Grand Secretary Zhang Zhuzheng. When the Wanli emperor was a newly enthroned 9-year-old in 1573, Zhang Zhuzheng had given him a large hand-painted album with attractive pictures and handwritten explanations to supplement his formal instruction. The manuscript version was reproduced in a full-size woodblock printed facsimile soon afterward, with large facing pages for the picture and punctuated text. There's a 4-character title in the upper right corner of the picture, and the main figures, such as here, the great Yu, first emperor of the Xia dynasty, are also given name labels. The stories of good models began with the deeds attributed to the sage emperors of antiquity and went in chronological order through the late 11th century, the Northern Song period. The 36 cautionary stories followed in a separate volume and again were chronologically organized. The story here is about Great Yu, the founding emperor of the Xia, who allegedly set up 5 different kinds of musical instrument outside the palace gate so that people could strike them according to what issue they wanted to bring to the emperor's attention. And from inside his palace, he would hear which instrument was struck and would know what kind of official to send out to deal with the problem. Very efficient. Zhang Zhuzheng also had the palace workshop publish a smaller and more modest version of the Emperor's Mirror to circulate among officials in Beijing. Ostensibly, his purpose was to encourage them to remember their responsibility to advise and assist the emperor. Remember, he was still just a 9-year-old. But no doubt Zhang also intended to bolster his own influence over the central bureaucracy, especially because he had some prefaces from very fancy people printed along with the pictures. The quality was fairly ordinary, certainly by comparison with the full-size facsimile, but it circulated widely and was much reprinted and even went to Korea. Here I'm showing the illustration of that same story about Great Yu and the musical instruments, and I'm going to stick with this story for several more comparisons. So the musical instruments is probably pretty obvious, 3 on the left and 2 on the right. The Emperor's Mirror clearly explained tales and had engaging illustrations of palace life, and this proved irresistible to commercial publishers who recognized that ordinary people might find the pictures and the simplified language accessible and entertaining as well as instructive. In Nanjing, the publisher Huxian quickly issued the most influential and widely circulated commercial edition, a recut that reproduced everything in Zhang Zhuzhang's edition. But a comparison between 2 corresponding half folios shows that Huxian sped up production and kept down costs by using cruder carving techniques and simplifying the scenes. Here he's simplified just to 1 bell, and on the other side there's just 1 drum. And the carving techniques that are a little cruder, the black areas are where he didn't, the block carver didn't cut away, but rather just left the block surface. So this actually takes quite a lot more work. However, Huxian addressed the ordinary reader's convenience by adding the page numbers inside the pictures. They are in Zhang Zhuzhang's edition, but way up in the upper left corner. They aren't really that helpful, but anyway, so Huxian kind of knew his audience. Huxian's edition was very successful and circulated widely, including to Japan, where it not only served as a convenient digest of Chinese history, but also it represented the legitimizing authority of the Chinese moral political traditions, and military leaders used it to establish and consolidate their power. In 1606, it was reprinted in the name of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the young son and successor of Hideyoshi. A preface by his advisor, Saisho Shotai, claimed that the boy shogun was devoted to the book and wanted to circulate it for wider benefit. This effort to strengthen Hideyori's precarious position by presenting him as a wise leader ultimately failed, and he was deposed and killed by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1615. Nonetheless, the book was a success, and there were soon multiple editions with the text translated into Japanese and placed before the pictures for the convenience of readers. Not to mention the illustration of stories about good rulers that were blown up into large-scale screen paintings that Tokugawa shoguns commissioned to display in reception halls, and thereby suggests that they identified with Confucian exemplars. And there even were sumptuously painted and hand-calligraphed 18th century small-sized album versions for the powerless imperial court in Kyoto. The book's lessons became more relevant for the Japanese emperor when the 16-year-old Meiji emperor assumed direct rule in 1868. And when I went to look at all of the editions of The Emperor's Mirror in the Japanese Imperial Household Agency, they not only had 15 copies of the book, some actually contained notes written by late 19th century imperial tutors, suggesting they had used it to instruct him. Going back to China, after Zhang Zhuzhang died in 1582, his enemies soon persuaded the Wanli emperor to punish him posthumously for corruption and immorality. The formerly conscientious emperor also threw off Zhang's heavy-handed indoctrination, and from then on became an erratic ruler with disastrous consequences for Ming governance. Some 20 years later, Jinlian came upon a copy of The Emperor's Mirror in the heir apparent's palace and resolved to reprint it in hopes of reforming society from the emperor on down. But instead of reproducing its often formulaic and repetitive illustrations, Jin commissioned new designs from the Huang family workshop. The biting comments in both his and Li Weizhen's prefaces suggest that this superior quality publication, with pictures by name brand artists, was intended for limited circulation among a select audience, probably of Nanjing literati who shared their political outlook and frustrations, as well as appreciating fine craftsmanship. The redesigned pictures are far less overtly didactic, and they are not repetitive. And the two halves of the composition were carved on separate blocks and printed on separate sheets that became whole as facing pages in the bound book. So this allowed viewers to savor the whole illustration at once rather than having to turn the page to see the left half, which is why all the pictures I've shown of the other editions are divided. Also, the four character story titles now appear inconspicuously just outside the picture frames, and the main figures no longer have name labels. In fact, the scene I've been showing doesn't even include the figure of the emperor inside his palace. It just shows a petitioner and an official sent out to deal with him. In 1622, in one of the many twists and turns of late Ming factional politics, the Tianqi emperor pardoned Zhang Zhuzheng posthumously and restored him to full honors. A few months later, the palace published a new edition of The Emperor's Mirror, which was a recut based on Hu Xian's low-budget commercial edition. In place of the flowery prefaces and colophons that had flattered Zhang Zhuzheng in the original edition, a single foreword briefly summarizes the book's contents and instructional purpose. It's signed by 8 eunuchs in the Directorate of Ceremonial, the Sulijian, one of whom was soon to be notorious under the name Wei Zhongxian. The somewhat simple-minded Tianqi emperor proclaimed that the emperor's mirror was sufficient for teaching him how to rule, and he refused his tutor's request to move on to more demanding texts, such as the Zhizhitongjian, the comprehensive mirror for aid and governance. Apparently, he spent much of his time in carpentry. The tumultuous last decades of the Ming Dynasty and the wrenching dislocations caused by the Manchu conquest in the mid-17th century made the early years of the Wanli Emperor's reign, the 1570s that is, seem orderly and stable in retrospect, and Zhang Zhuzheng's posthumous reputation as its dominant figure rose in the 17th and 18th centuries. The illustrated book continued to be reprinted in China, and both painted and printed versions appeared in 18th century Paris, where they represented an ideal of enlightened governance. The paintings were sent from Beijing by the French missionary Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot to Henri Bertin, a former minister of state who admired China as an empire ruled by a wise emperor who was advised by scholar officials. This was during the Qianlong reign. 95 paintings were mounted into 2 European-style volumes with gilt-edged pages, and explanations appeared on the facing pages, based on the Chinese text, but freely modified for the French reader, usually by cutting out details while adding more context. I've translated this one quite literally, including its capitalization pattern, which might remind you of someone. Great Yu, to maintain the peace and good order in his empire, thinking that there were only a small number of his subjects who had the liberty to speak to him, and that the great number were not able to convey their complaints to him or to give him appropriate advice, had 5 kinds of instruments of music, whose sounds carried far, placed outside the gate of the palace, and had the emperor's intentions explained to people called mandarins, that according to matters on which someone wished to speak to the emperor, one would beat on one of the musical instruments that were at the gate of the palace. The emperor from inside the palace, hearing one of said instruments beaten, would identify on what matter someone wished to speak with him, and would give an order to have the persons who were requesting audience brought in. He immediately thus resolved a multitude of matters that otherwise would have dragged on for a long time in the courts. So it leaves out the details from the Chinese text specifying which type of musical instrument to be used for which type of issue, and it brings in a reference to the French judicial system The majority of scenes symbolize ideals of good rule, although both volumes mix good and bad rulers, and they don't follow strict chronological order. The seal of the Royal Library appears on each of the paintings, suggesting that the compendium was presented to a French ruler, perhaps Louis XVI. The foreword to Volume 1 may be translated as saying, "This collection of paintings contains the principal traits that characterize some Chinese emperors. It was made to serve as instruction to the emperors, placing under their eyes that which had made their predecessors admirable or despicable. This collection was presented to the reigning emperor." In 1788, the commercial engraver Isidor Stanislas Hellmann published a radically redesigned and chronologically reorganized selection of pictures with much revised texts. He took on this project after having made illustrations of the life of Confucius for another of Bertin's projects to bring knowledge about China to France. This picture comes from volume 12 of the multi-volume Mémoires concernant l'histoire, les sciences, les arts, les mœurs, les usages, etc. des Chinois. Volume 12 out of, I think, 16 or something. As Hellmann had done in the pictures of the life of Confucius, he now depicts the figures for the Emperor's Mirror in neoclassical style and settings with Western perspective and shading. But here he also makes unsubtle allusions to the French monarchy in pictures and explanations about bad rulers. It seems that rather than intending this publication to enlighten or inspire the king, Hellmann was channeling anti-monarchical sentiment on the eve of the French Revolution. This is particularly clear in his depictions of notorious women favored by bad rulers because they wear a feathered headdress associated with Marie Antoinette. On the other hand, the book includes a fawning dedication to her sister-in-law, who was married to Louis's younger brother and was known simply as Madame. The title page indicates that Hellmann intended to publish 4 installments of this Fait Mémorable, 2 months apart, and he advertises them for sale at various levels of quality and price, and available in both monochrome and with watercolor. However, he abandoned the project after the first installment came out and turned to subject matter more directly related to the ideals of the French Revolution. Returning to China one more time, a large-size version of the Emperor's Mirror, illustrated and discussed, was created by Qing court painters and calligraphers in the latter part of the 19th century, probably to use for the book's original purpose, instructing a young emperor. Both the Tongzhi and Guangxu emperors came to the throne as young boys, and lessons based on this book are recorded in the diary of the imperial tutor Wang Tonghe. The format recalls the original one for the Wanli emperor, with painting and calligraphy on the facing leaves of large albums, but the stories have been pared down to only 56 and treat only the good models. I've looked at the list of which models are included, and some of the good ones are skipped. So it isn't a question of just, oh, they lost the latter part. No, they didn't ever do it. Perhaps the reason was to avoid showing the young emperors how much fun the things done by bad emperors might be. In fact, Li Weizhen's preface to Jin Lian's 1604 editions had lamented that the Wanli emperor imitated those kinds of deeds much more often than modeling his actions on the good ones. So these are just some of the many variations on the Emperor's Mirror, illustrated and discussed, and there are many others, but I suspect you've seen enough to grasp that the versions range widely in form and quality, as well as in purpose and reception. Differences in the manner of presentation and quality of production may indicate distinctions among intended viewers in terms of social status, wealth, taste, interest, level of literacy, etc., and so forth. But the political and historical contexts are also important, And looking into them helps us understand why this work could function so differently in China, Korea, Japan, and France. Well, I will leave it at that for now and open the floor for questions. But first, I want to congratulate the Department of Art History on reaching this 100-year milestone. And I look forward to the upcoming events that will showcase some of its accomplishments. So thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you for this very rich talk. So, questions?
Okay, I have, are we on? All right, we have a mic here. If someone has a question, we'll run it over to you.
People still digesting.
Can digest.
No one ever wants to go first.
Yeah. I was tempted to put in some 20th century examples, but nah, it goes too far.
So maybe I ask one. I actually don't know. So my question is not related to this emperor's mural, but about this Japanese reappropriation of this erotic prints. So I noticed the poems are different.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit more. So those poems were written by Japanese or by Chinese. They just basically they have freedom to alter the kind of the set of the poems and image.
Yeah, I haven't looked at more than the couple of examples. They are reproduced in a very lavishly published 3 large volume compendium by the collector who owns all of these things, the erotic things, not just the Chinese, but also that Japanese example. So this question could be answered very specifically, but all I will say for now is that particular poem is on another leaf of the pictures of the height of sophistication. And I assume, and I didn't take the time to actually look, how did they change, but I don't know whether they changed the matching on purpose or just, doesn't matter too much. I mean, we're more interested in the pictures, aren't we? I mean, yeah, but that's a question that could be answered. Tom Dale.
Thank you, Julia, for a very elegant lecture. And I was really interested in the moment of exchange with Western Europe. You showed the representation of a religious image from Sevilla, I think. Mm-hmm. But I was interested if there were other kinds of relationships that would relate to the genre of the speculum principis. So in Western Europe, there was something similar to this idea of the mirror, of the emperor's mirror, and I just wondered whether there were any interactions between these related genres between Europe and China.
I really don't know the answer to that. I think there are people that have looked into this possibility. I mean, I think someone whose name I am not recalling did something on, the Book of Kings or some kind of title like that had exactly the same, idea of, they were models for the contemporary rulers. Whether either side got the idea from the other, I really doubt it.
The Islamic world has it too.
Yes, exactly.
You're just asking now, so I have to walk across.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think in this moment where we are waxing on 100 years and the department and recognizing that there are so many students in the room today, I wonder if I might ask you a question about method. We've certainly, through your talk, seen the benefits of taking a sort of singular image and following its traces as it's evolved and changed and moved over hundreds of years and across the globe. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what went into this research of yours, what challenges, what benefits, maybe any suggestions that you have for the young art history students in the room today.
Okay. I guess the first thing I would say is I just focus on the one scene just to kind of keep the points that I was trying to make a little clearer. But, in fact, there are 117. And so, yeah, when I first started working on this, I was going in person to libraries around the world, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, London, Paris, and sitting down and writing down notes. Nowadays, it isn't quite so necessary to do that because things are often available online or through databases that can be acquired. But I personally feel it's still important as much as possible to see the original work in the physical reality of your space and be able to, really get a sense of its materiality. So in a way, I would say, don't take up a topic like this. It'll take you years. But I kind of also feel that, my kind of art history it's never been mainstream, so maybe I'm not the right person to give advice. I did I think it was mentioned in the introduction that my background is very much an interdisciplinary one. East Asian studies was equally important as the art history. In fact, I had more East Asian studies in coursework. So I'm always, kind of looking at how are things functioning in their context and the time they were made and times later on and even now. So that's a particular approach, and I don't know that that's something that everyone should be trying to imitate.
Well, just to follow up, you said you first wrote on one of these for your senior thesis.
Not on these, no, but on the artist Chen Hongshou.
Okay.
His paintings.
Okay.
Because when I was a junior, taking the Arts of China class, I got shivers down my back when I saw the painting, a self-portrait by Chen Hongshou, and I was like, I got to work on this artist. And so, yeah, that's sort of where that started, and I've always been interested in it. He's a very interesting late Ming artist.
Well, that's very inspiring, and I think that's important. And I think I had extremely important formative experiences, as a junior in college and things like that, got me fired up. And I think people should remember that it's real what you do as an undergraduate and gets you going in different ways. Mm-hmm. And so you've been pursuing this since you were an undergraduate.
In one way or another.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you again. I was wondering, since the words are carved into the blocks as well, right? For the
in this
books?
particular one that you're looking
Just any
at,
of them?
these are actually handwritten with a brush on silk, but the go back to a few earlier ones. Yeah, these are carved into the wood block and then printed.
Did that contribute to them, I don't know, people disliking these kinds of books? I know that calligraphy was considered quite a high art.
Well, you could have fine calligraphy in a printed book. The carvers were incredibly skilled at imitating absolutely every nuance of the line. So if it was a carefully produced work, then it would be almost as good as looking at the ink calligraphy.
I was so interested in the way that you handled presenting visual material that you anticipated we either might have some difficulty with, or that you were not willing to have us look at. So thinking about the ethics and politics of what you're showing, and I thought the elegance of the particular modesty square, I don't know quite how else to describe that, but was an interesting solution. And as somebody who researches things that are so often behind the stanchions in museums that say that this is the material that might offend the public, we're all teaching in a moment in which we're figuring out a new what to show, how to show, when it's so easy to reproduce. I couldn't help resist taking visual notes during the lecture. I'm just curious about your thoughts behind the decisions in terms of how to show what you're showing, and again, also thinking about not just the young scholars in the room, but also thinking about us still, trying to negotiate this moment.
Well, personally, I don't think you can err on the side of caution. I mean, my natural inclination is, I don't like that stuff. So I'm happy to cover it up. But as far as how to advise other people, I don't know. I mean, nowadays, things go out in the wild internet and you cannot control what happens to them. So maybe you have to be a little careful what you put up. I like that modesty square. I mean, I just drew a box, text box and PowerPoint and colored it with a black background.
Hello, Professor. I'm Wendy Wu. I'm a first-year PhD student here in the department, and I have to personally thank you for your endeavor in establishing the Keeling Fellowship. And I have a question that's tied back to the last bit of your lecture. I'm really curious about the influence and impact of Henry Hellman's edition of the Empress Mirror. I just wonder, how influential or what kind of impact his print had on the French politics, or I don't know, of his contemporary age, and when did this kind of sort of idealization of Chinese politics die out in Europe, and how did it die out eventually? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think you probably want to be speaking to a French historian to get the real answers that you're looking for. But I will only say that there are many, many copies of the Hellman's publications. So it clearly was something that was popular at the time, and lots of copies dispersed all over the place, including some with the color. I mean, he advertised that it was available in, with aquarelle, watercolor, and in different sizes. It could be combined with his series on battle prints, and many copies of this work have survived. So what impact did it have? I mean, I think the French Revolution might have marked the end of when people were thinking that maybe we could have a wise emperor who listens to his officials' advice. Because I don't think Louis XVI was particularly effective that way. Yeah, I don't know. I think, you really need to ask someone else.
Jennifer. Sorry.
Julia, thank you for your wonderful lecture. I was looking at, as you mentioned, you went to so many different libraries and across different places, and you kind of showed us some of the different locations where it had an impact. And so I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of more of a glimpse of this larger project, which is a very multi-sited, multinational project as well. And so just to where this is heading.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm going to do a whole lot more with it at the moment. Um, I have published on this in a few places, in a few iterations. I mean, I guess mostly it was in the context of narrative illustration, and only kind of secondarily book production. And I think I need to learn more about a lot of the details of the publishing industry, especially late Ming, which is a big field, actually. I mean, there's plenty that I could find out. Yeah, I guess the connection, especially in the French series that included, you know, a whole life of Confucius, you know, that's really where my heart is. I mean, I still work on images that relate to Confucius, so I'm still going in that direction rather than more in this more general one, which I think I've done with for the time being.
Thank you so much for this really rich talk. I'm actually curious about the afterlives of some of these within China. So, I mean, you mentioned the kind of illustrations within France responding to political situations there. And so what happens to the reception of these works when there's no longer a Chinese emperor within China?
You mean in the 20th century?
Yeah.
Well, some of them were just, you know, sitting in people's private collections or put into public libraries once those were established. In an article that I published some time ago in, I think it was called the East Asian Library Journal, I think it was one of the last issues before they folded, I actually included discussion of well, not quite contemporary, almost contemporary People's Republic of China editions, one of which reproduced very nice pictures, but just translated the text into simplified characters. And then there was another one that changed the pictures to be much more kind of lurid and kind of the, you know, antiquity must be people are primitive running around with no clothes and that kind of thing. It was just really weird, but very pedagogical too, because first of all, the text was punctuated, and then there was a kind of a summary of it in sort of easier language, and then there was a lesson to be learned that was sort of the last part, and it was all about, you know, feudal society and all that sort of stuff. So that was that. But then it's also been, I mean, I haven't paid close attention lately, but I also remember seeing it in a series that was just about, you know, 100 emperors from antiquity. So that, you know, taking away any didactic message. So I think it's still just very useful for things.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I do have a very specific question about the architectural setting of the Empress Mirror, because in the printed works, the architecture seemed to vary a lot in different versions, and also like in the scenario of Japan, like for example in the Nagoya castle, it seems to be a pavilion inside the castle. So I am just very curious if any continuity, as you notice, like among different versions and printed works, and also when they are on different surfaces, are there any changes or, yeah, thank you.
Well, this one is blown up to much bigger size than the printed page. You know, this is I don't know exactly how tall it is, but it's a full standing Fusuma screen, sliding door screen. And the illustration is of a good emperor who is dissuaded from building an extravagant observation platform. So, you know, he takes the advice, don't waste the people's money on this frivolous project. And I mean, it's very, very similar to the printed image. I could have brought an example, but I didn't. Instead, I just showed sort of what these screens look like in the palace reception hall, or the shogun's hall. The architecture, it's very similar to the printed one, and this thing over here, it's like the foundation for such a tower, that is not going to be built. And these people are sort of standing there calling attention to the fact that this is not going to happen. And the emperor, and this is sort of a different moment, I suppose, but supposedly sitting on his throne and taking advice. But I don't know, is that what you were trying to get at, or is that off the mark?
Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. Invite you to join us. The panel discussions start tomorrow at 1 o'clock in this room. And there's a reception tomorrow night and more panels on Friday and another wonderful lecture here at 4:30 on Friday by Professor Emeritus Henry Druhl. But before we leave, let's thank Dr. Murray one more time with a round of applause. And a big welcome back for those of you visiting, including Professor Murray. So welcome, and hope to see you in the next few days.